And just like that, we are in week 7 of the 2025 fantasy football season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to run through every single matchup, go over every single running back, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 7 of the fantasy season. All right, so very quickly here, we have just 2 teams on bye week here in week 7. We're going to have the Baltimore Ravens, so no Derrick Henry, and the Buffalo Bills, so no James Cook. 2 pretty big running backs here on bye in week 7, so make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Pittsburgh Steelers traveling to face the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. Jaylen Warren coming off of a not-so-great game in Week 6 at home against the Browns. 8.3 fantasy points, had 52 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 2 catches, 11 receiving yards, and we did still see involvement out of Kenneth Gainwell, who had 6 touches on the ground, 6 targets, 6 catches, 14 receiving yards. So Gainwell at 9.6 fantasy points, Jaylen Warren at 8.3 fantasy points, but technically speaking, Warren still saw more overall volume in this backfield. This is still kind of a confusing split, and the thing that's starting to concern me for Jaylen Warren owners is that we are seeing receiving work go to Kenneth Gainwell. So sure, I could see either running back having a nice day here. I'm going to keep the faith in Jaylen Warren, who has still ultimately been the more productive running back on a consistent basis for the Steelers this year, but could see Kenneth Gainwell also having a nice game because they both have a really good matchup here against the Cincinnati Bengals, the team that is allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis here in the 2025 season. So if you own Kenneth Gainwell, like I have him as a sit, but maybe this is a player that if you're desperate, you could play this week, even on a short week, just a really good matchup for him. Jaylen Warren, I want to keep the faith here. I think he could have a really nice game against the Bengals, but both running backs here will have an opportunity. So I have Gainwell as a sit, but quite frankly, he's probably closer to a flex option this week. He sits at 60% roster. If you're in a really, really bad spot, could maybe take the matchup here. But once again, as you guys know, I don't really love Thursday Night Football matchups. I tend to try and stay away, but when it's a defense like this, we definitely need to be paying attention. Then on the other side of things, we have Chase Brown, just in the startable category. He's been here for quite a few weeks now. Unfortunately, did not have double-digit points this past week as he did in weeks 4 and week 5. Week 6, 9 touches on the ground, 42 rushing yards, 2 targets, 2 catches, for 7 receiving yards, just 8.9 fantasy points. And the Steelers have been like not great against the run, but they still rank pretty high in terms of fantasy points allowed. They are a top 12 unit against fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So this is not necessarily a great spot. The Bengals are at home here in week 7, so that helps. Maybe Joe Flacco's got some magic for this team. At least had a little bit of magic this past week. So I don't know. Chase Brown startable, but the upside just completely gone with no Joe Burrow in this lineup. So we'll leave it at that as we approach week 7. All right, early Sunday morning, we're going to have another international overseas matchup between the Rams and the Jaguars. Let's start with the Rams side of things. Kyren Williams remains a must-start running back. Was one of my favorite running backs going into week 6 against a very, very porous Baltimore Ravens run defense. He had 16.7 fantasy points, 50 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 2 targets, 2 catches, 37 receiving yards. A week after having his best fantasy performance of the season so far, even with the 2 lost fumbles between weeks 4 and 5. Kyren Williams is still the clear-cut RB1 for the Rams, and we saw Blake Corum get a little bit banged up this past week, so he's considered day-to-day. Maybe we get some volume to rookie running back Jarquez Hunter here, but regardless, this is Kyren Williams' backfield, and while this Jaguars defense certainly nothing to sneeze at, a top 12 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position, and a defense that has been really impressive this year, you still got to start a player like Kyren Williams on a weekly basis. He's a strong start this week. Now, we look to the Jaguars. I bumped Travis Etienne down from the start category to the startable category as he's had 9.5 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games, 12 touches on the ground, 27 rushing yards this past week, 5 targets, 4 catches for 28 receiving yards. And kind of the thing with the Jaguars offense right now is it's starting to open up just a little bit here. We're starting to see Brian Thomas get a little bit back to what we got out of his rookie season, right? Travis Hunter's getting more involvement. Other players at the wide receiver position are starting to make some contributions in the receiving game. The tight ends are involved. They're spreading the football around a lot. They're playing really good defense. I think ultimately that's kind of hurting Travis Etienne, but I still think at any given week he could get back, to what we saw early in the season. So I still like Etienne, still think he's solid here, but this is a tough matchup. The Rams are the 3rd best unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So there's that. But I still think Etienne, good start this week, but I just don't want to get too crazy here. Could depend on who else you guys have on your roster as we approach week 7. All right, and I have believed in Kyren Williams all year long, and I'm not giving up here in week 7 this season. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Kyren Williams to score a touchdown in this early morning matchup here in week 7. He has scored a touchdown in every single game except for 2 on the season so far. So love this spot for Kyren Williams. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL pick 'em to use towards week 7 NFL action. Take that free pick 'em, take Kyren Williams to score a touchdown. If both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, when you sign up using promo code THECATCH, Underdog is also going to give you $50 in bonus cash as soon as you play through $5 on Underdog, and they're going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below if you want to take advantage of all of their exclusive Week 7 NFL offers. All right, let's move into the early afternoon slate for Sunday. We're going to start with the Eagles traveling to face the Vikings. What do we do with Saquon Barkley coming off of a game where he had just 8.7 fantasy points against his former team on Thursday Night Football in the New York Football Giants? 58 yards on the ground off of 12 touches, 3 targets, 2 catches, 9 receiving yards, no touchdowns. Don't panic here. This is a good spot on the road here against a Minnesota Vikings defense that's been pretty bad against the run on the season so far. They come in 19th overall against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So this is kind of a get-right spot for Saquon. And really, when you look at the game script against the Giants, like the Eagles needed to throw the football, right? You look to week 3 when Saquon only had 9.5 fantasy points against the Rams. Another game script there where the Eagles needed to throw the football, right? And we've seen weeks like week 5, once again, a game script where the Eagles need to throw the football, where Barkley got a little bit more involved in the passing game and scored a receiving touchdown, kind of saved his fantasy day there. We need that kind of involvement if the Eagles get behind, but I think that this type of game script will go a little bit different against Carson Wentz and company. Even on the road here, it's a good spot, good matchup. Let's not overreact. I still think Saquon Barkley is a very strong start here in week 7 of the season. And then we have the Vikings coming off of their bye week. I still really like Jordan Mason going into week 7 here. He's at 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games and 3 touchdowns in the last 3 games. Looks like Aaron Jones is not going to be ready to go this week. Could be ready next week, so we'll talk about that next week. But here against the Eagles, who, like, a lot of people think about this Eagles defense, you're like, the Eagles defense so good, but this is a bottom 10 unit against opposing running backs when it comes to fantasy points scored. They just got absolutely torched by both Jackson Dart and Cam Scatterbo on the ground. So I like the spot for Jordan Mason, regardless of what's going on at quarterback. I'm assuming it's Carson Wentz, but he is dealing with that shoulder injury. So maybe it'll be J.J. McCarthy who's set to practice. Whatever, I don't care. I still like Jordan Mason. Solid start here in week 7 of the season. Moving along, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Titans in what should be a very underwhelming matchup, at least for the running back position. Listen, I'm just going to try not to talk too much about the Patriots running backs here. We got Ramondre Stevenson. We got Travion Henderson. This is the most frustrating running back room, in my opinion, when it comes to fantasy football. Ramondre Stevenson had 1.38 yards per carry this week. Okay, or this past week, I should say. And he out-touched Travion Henderson still. Henderson, only 3 yards per carry. The Saints' run defense actually surprisingly been okay this year. But still, like, Antonio Gibson's on IR. We got Ramondre Stevenson having fumbling issues, although he didn't fumble this past week. And we're still not getting the involvement out of Travion Henderson. Maybe Travion Henderson is just not as good as we thought he could potentially be in his rookie season. I don't know here, but the rest of the Patriots offenses look pretty dang good, and you would really like to see just a consistent running back option when it comes to fantasy football. And it really feels like Henderson should be getting more volume. He's just not. With all that being said, it's a good matchup. The Titans are a bottom 5 unit against opposing running backs when it comes to fantasy points allowed. So sure, you could flex either of these guys, but you're crossing your fingers, basically touchdown or bust here. And I'm really getting over the Patriots running back room as this season progresses, but they're flexible. Just prepare for disappointment. All right, Tony Pollard, startable. Or no, I got him down to flex this week, actually. 6.7 fantasy points this past week, 34 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 2 catches, 13 receiving yards, and he was on the field for 43% of snaps, and Tajay Spears on the field for 59% of snaps. He had 5 touches, 31 rushing yards, 4 targets, 4 catches, 19 receiving yards. So starting to see Spears get a little bit in the mix here, and ultimately the Titans offense just awful. I just got the notification a few minutes ago that they fired their head coach, Brian Callahan, so maybe that changes something here. I don't know. The Patriots have been pretty dang good against the run, a top 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I'm just going to leave Tony Pollard as a flex, and this volume that Tajay Spears is starting to see could really begin to hurt Tony Pollard's overall value here. But he can still have some nice weeks, I believe. I still like Pollard, but I'm not going to call him anything more than a flex here in week 7 of the season. I think Tajay Spears too soon. We're going to leave him in the sit category, but definitely a player to keep a strong eye on as we move into week 7. Next up, we have the greatest backfield in fantasy football, and the Carolina Panthers traveling to face the New York Jets. Let's start with the Panthers side of things. They get the Jets this week. Decent enough matchup. They're kind of middle of the pack against the run in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, but doesn't matter because Rico Dowdle's had 32.4 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games, 6.1 yards per carry or better in 2 straight games, 183 rushing yards or better in 2 straight games. We looked at week 6, 183 rushing yards on the ground, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 56 receiving yards, a receiving tutty. Here's the problem is we don't know if Chuba Hubbard's going to play here in week 7 or not, so it's really difficult to evaluate this backfield. And Rico Dowdle just went against 2 of the very worst defenses, 2 bottom 5 units when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the running back position. They were both home games for the Panthers. This is a road game. The Jets, not the greatest, but certainly not the worst against opposing running backs. So this is kind of a tough area. I don't think Rico Dowdle is just like a no-doubt must start. Now, if Chuba misses this week, or in week 7, then Dowdle definitely gets bumped up, I would say, to a must-start category. But if Chuba plays, I think we're going to see a bit of a split and involvement from both running backs because Chuba was dominating the touches through the first 4 weeks of the season in this backfield. So this is a tough one to evaluate this early in the week. I'm not saying if you own Dowdle, you should be like not feeling good. You should probably be feeling great. But once again, 2 home games against 2 of the worst, not just run defenses, but 2 of the worst defenses in the NFL. I think it's going to slow down a bit here on the road in week 7 against the Jets. But really, the bigger issue is not knowing the status of Chuba Hubbard at this point in the week. So I think Dowdle, Chuba are definitely both startable. But once again, the health of Chuba Hubbard is really going to determine what we do here. So we'll just have to kind of wait as the week progresses. I've got Breece Hall bumped down to the startable category this week. Panthers have been a much better run unit than they were last year, but they're still kind of middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed. They're not great, but they're certainly not as bad as they were last year. Breece Hall is still the running back that you want to start in this backfield. And I feel like the Jets do this. Like they have these really, really bad weeks and they bounce back and like they're okay. And I think this is kind of a get right spot at home for them coming off of what was just an awful, awful performance. But don't forget, they had an awful performance in week 2, and then Breece Hall, Justin Fields, Garrett Wilson were really solid for a couple weeks. So I still think Breece Hall very startable here. It just depends on who else is on your roster. But unfortunately, really just due to the nature of this offense. His upside is capped. He has not scored a single touchdown this season, so he really relies on that receiving work for the most part to get him through in terms of his fantasy points on a week-to-week basis. But once again, he's startable, and we're just going to leave it at that here in week 7 of the season. All right, next up, we have the Dolphins traveling to face the Browns. Tale of two different stories when it comes to these run defenses. Let's start with Devon Achane and the Dolphins. Achane coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season. 31 fantasy points, 128 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 4 catches off of 6 targets for 22 receiving yards. He is your RB3 before Monday Night Football has been played in both half and full PPR right now. Tough matchup on the road here as the Browns have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to running backs, but you got to start Devon Achane. You got to feel good about him regardless of matchup. There's really nothing else to say here. The Chargers have dropped back in their rankings, so it kind of feels like he just had this really big game against a good run defense, but the Chargers' run defense is starting to look really, really porous in the past few weeks. So it just doesn't matter. If you got Achane, you got to feel good. You got to keep rolling with him. He's a must-start running back every single week. Quinshon Judkins, though, coming off of his worst performance as a starter here in the 2025 season, 3.6 fantasy points. And I thought that was a pretty good spot against the Steelers this past week. 12 touches, 36 yards on the ground, 1 target, 0 catches, no tutties. Dylan Gabriel, not nearly as effective as he was in week 5 against the Vikings. Dylan Gabriel was 29 of 52. The Browns threw the football at a ridiculous rate in week 6 and still couldn't get much done. So I don't want to overreact too much here because when we look at this is a smash matchup. The Miami Dolphins are a bottom 5 unit against opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed. They're getting lit up on a weekly basis. You got to feel good if you own Judkins. Let's just wipe off last week as, an X and the poorest overall performance, whatever. Let's move along. I think this is a much better spot at home against the Miami Dolphins defense. You got to feel good here if you own Judkins, but hopefully Dylan Gabriel and this offense can kind of get it going and we can see some better offensive performance as a whole because that's going to benefit Judkins. But if there's a week that they're going to get it right, it's at home here in week 7 against the Dolphins. Next up, we have the Saints who will travel to face the Bears. And I do have to record this before Monday Night Football has been played, so if anything happens to DeAndre Swift or the Bears running backs, I'll have a pinned comment down below. Don't yell at me. But let's start with the Saints side of things. Kamara, I had as startable last week, 12.6 fantasy points in week 6. Not bad. 10 touches on the ground, 31 rushing yards, 5 targets, 5 catches, 45 receiving yards, compared to Kendre Miller, who had 8 touches, 21 yards on the ground, 1 target, 1 catch, 11 receiving yards. So Kendre Miller is still a very good handcuff to own. This is a good matchup. Maybe he gets more involvement against one of the worst run defenses in the league and the Chicago Bears, but still, I think Kamara gets bumped up to the start category due to the matchup as the Bears are allowing the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I like Kamara this week. It's a good spot even on the road here. I think you keep rolling with him. And then DeAndre Swift, I'm just going to leave in the startable category. He's been really solid in his past 3 performances, once again, not including Monday Night Football. 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games before the bye week for DeAndre Swift and the Bears. So maybe after Monday Night Football, my thoughts will change here. But I will mention, like I said earlier, the Saints defense is allowing, they rank 13th against opposing running backs when it comes to fantasy points allowed. So it's not really a great matchup here, but the Bears are at home. I think DeAndre Swift, as long as he gets enough involvement in the passing game, will remain startable as we move into week 7. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Chiefs for a good divisional matchup. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. Ashton Jeanty, I'm going to leave in the start category. Really the only running back that I would feel good about in this entire matchup. Another solid performance in week 6, 16.6 fantasy points, 75 yards on the ground, had a rushing touchdown, 2 catches off of 4 targets for 11 receiving yards. Now, the Chiefs' run defense has improved. They were a little bit poor earlier in the season, but now they're ranking kind of middle of the pack, getting a little bit better. We always know that they have that capability with a great defensive coordinator, right? So this could be a tough spot for the Raiders on the road in Arrowhead. Geno Smith is not looking great at the moment, and I do think the Chiefs defense, once again, is starting to look better. They're one of my favorite defenses to stream if you guys play in leagues that have defensive special team slots. So I'm a little worried about Genty this week. I think this past 3 weeks could kind of slow down a bit in terms of fantasy production here, but it's hard to put him elsewhere other than a start. He's still a top 10 running back in full and half PPR on the season so far. So going to leave him in the start category, but I'm a little wary of Ashton Genty this week if this game turns ugly quickly. Now, when it comes to the Chiefs running backs, I've said it every single week. I want nothing to do with these guys. It's touchdown or bust. If they don't find the end zone, you're going to feel awful for starting them. I know we have 2 big running backs on bye week here in week 7 of the season, but still, I wouldn't be going out of my way to start any Chiefs running backs. You'd have to be absolutely desperate. And while the Raiders' defense is not great by any stretch, they're okay against the run, at least better against the run than they are against the pass. So I don't know. I just can't start a Chiefs running back with any confidence. You know, it could be Hunt this week. It could be Pacheco. Maybe Brashard Smith gets involvement. I don't know. But ultimately, you just cannot trust this backfield when it comes to fantasy football. So I have all the Chiefs running backs as sits here in week 7 of the season. All right, let's move into the afternoon slate of games. We're going to start with the Colts traveling to face the Chargers. This should be a good matchup. Jonathan Taylor is your RB2 in full PPR, your RB1 in half PPR, and he is a must-start running back every single week, no matter what. But like I mentioned earlier in the video, this Chargers run defense has been pretty bad the past 2 or 3 weeks, and they've really moved back in overall rankings. So JT, very good spot here. Since week 3 of the season, he has 6 touchdowns. He's absolutely balling out. 123 yards on the ground this past week against the Cardinals, a rushing touchdown, 4 targets, 4 catches, 14 receiving yards, 23.7 fantasy points. He has 23.7 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 2. I don't need to say anything else. If you own Jonathan Taylor, you are feeling absolutely great going into the week. When it comes to Chargers running backs, you're probably feeling okay if you own Kamani Vidal, but maybe we see some more involvement out of Hassan Haskins this week. Maybe they trade for a running back. I just feel kind of murky about these Chargers running backs. I'm not sure if I'm trusting anything at the moment. Naheem Hines has been moved up to the active roster. We know Omarion Hampton is now set to miss more than 4 games as we initially expected. It was only going to be 4 games. Looks like his injury is a little bit more serious. So Vidal was the running back to own in week 6 against a really bad Dolphins defense. We're in week 7 now. This is a good Colts run defense. So I'll leave Vidal as startable. You just never know. Think about Michael Carter, Bam Knight. Like Michael Carter was looking like the running back to own for the Cardinals just 2 weeks ago. Then last week, Bam Knight, ended up being the more valuable fantasy running back. So just move with caution when you're in this type of situation. You never quite know what the coaching staff wants to do, what their intentions are, and this is a much, much less favorable matchup against the Colts defense, once again, compared to the Dolphins run defense this past week. So Vidal, definitely startable, but just don't be surprised if a little bit of disappointment creeps in here in week 7 of the season. Next up, we have the Giants, who will travel to face the Broncos. Cam Scatterbo looking like a fantasy MVP this year. He's your RB8 in full PPR, your RB9 and half PPR. He's coming off of a 31 fantasy point day against the Eagles. He had 98 yards on the ground, 3 rushing touchdowns, 2 targets, 2 catches, 12 receiving yards. I fully believe that no man on earth could have possibly stopped Cam Scatterbo from continuing to score touchdowns on Thursday Night Football against the Eagles if that game went on longer. So you got to feel good if you own Scatterbo going into week 7, but I have been talking about this stretch of games for a few weeks for the Giants players. If you guys went out and you have Jackson Dart, if you own Cam Scatterbo, if you went out and you got Rondell Robinson, Theo Johnson off the waivers, this is a tough matchup on the road against the Broncos this week, and they're on the road next week against Philly. I know they just decimated Philly, but once again, you never know. And then they get San Francisco. So, like, we're definitely learning a lot about this Giants team in this stretch. And once again, this Broncos defense, top 5 against opposing running backs. They've got what looks like to be the defensive player of the year, potentially Nick Bonito having a monster year. He had a monster year last year as well at the linebacker position. Like, this is not a team to mess around with. This is a really tough stadium to travel to. I always talk about traveling to Denver is one of the worst situations for teams that are traveling, right? So I'm just saying, maybe limit expectations here, but still, Scatabo since week 2 has had 13 or more fantasy points in every single game. So I still like him. I'm not going to move him out of the start category, but maybe he's a little bit of a lower end start this week against one of the best defenses in the entire NFL on the road. Then we look to the Broncos. What in the world? What happened this past week? 4 fantasy points for J.K. Dobbins against the Jets in that overseas game. He still had 14 touches for 40 rushing yards, so ultimately definitely still saw the bulk of the carries as R.J. Harvey on the ground through the air combined for just 6 touches. So still Dobbins backfield. Let's just scratch off last week. Let's move along. It's a much better matchup this week against the Giants, bottom 12 unit against opposing running backs. So Dobbins, I think, will bounce back. This is a great get-right spot at home. He scored a touchdown in every game this year except for 2. So if you own Dobbins, don't overreact here. Should be very solid here in week 7 of the season. Next up, we have the Packers who are going to travel to face the Cardinals. Josh Jacobs remains an absolute must-start running back regardless of the matchup, regardless of who he's facing. You have to start him. 32 fantasy points against the Bengals in week 6. 93 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 targets, 5 catches, 57 receiving yards. And he just had 31.7 fantasy points before the week 5 bye week in week 4. 12.4 more fantasy points every game this year. RB5 in full and half PPR. Great matchup against a bottom 12 unit against opposing running backs in the Arizona Cardinals when it comes to fantasy points allowed. Don't need to say anything else. Josh Jacobs, absolute must start this week. But what in the world do we do with these Cardinals running backs? Michael Carter had 9 touches, 34 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 2 catches, 30 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points this past week. Bam Knight had 11 touches, 34 yards on the ground, 2 targets, 1 reception, 20 receiving yards, a touchdown, 12.4 fantasy points. We got that early morning update that Bam Knight was going to be the starter. And ultimately, you didn't see that much more volume than Michael Carter. It really feels still like a 50-50 split. When you go back to week 5, Michael Carter saw more of the volume, but Bam Knight scored in a touchdown, right, as did Michael Carter. So what do we make of this backfield? I don't quite know. But what we do know is it's not a good matchup against a top 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs in the Green Bay Packers. But the Cardinals are at home. It's unclear at this point in the week if Kyler Murray or Jacoby Brissett's going to be the starter, which I do think is important here. But ultimately, you just can't feel great if you own either of these running backs. They should both be owned off of the waiver wire, I believe, going into week 7. But still, this is a tough matchup. I'm going to leave them both as flexes because I hate this type of volume in a split backfield, and it's a tough matchup against the Green Bay Packers. So if you're desperate, you could start one of these guys. But other than that, they're just going to be low-end flexes here in week 7 of the season. All right, next up we have the Commanders traveling to face the Cowboys. And once again, I am recording this before Monday Night Football. Don't yell at me in the comments if anything happens to Bill, but I'm expecting a big game out of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt against the Chicago Bears in week 6 at home in a great overall matchup. And regardless of what happens, this is another great overall matchup against another bottom 5 unit against the run in the Dallas Cowboys in a big divisional matchup in week 7. Even on the road here, you got to feel good about Bill. Once again, if anything happens or if the split here looks crazy and Chris Rodriguez or Jeremy McNichols getting more involvement, whatever, I'll have a pinned comment down below. But ultimately, I think JCM is going to be a must-start running back in week 7, just like he was in week 6. We'll find out what happens on Monday Night Football. Then we move to the Cowboys side of things. Javonte Williams got to remain a must-start. I know it was a tough day in week 6, 8.4 fantasy points, 29 yards on the ground, 8 targets, 5 catches, 5 receiving yards, after he had 12.2 or more fantasy points in every other game on the season and 19 or more fantasy points in 4 out of those 5 games. But yeah, you just got to keep rolling with Javonte Williams if you own him. The Commanders are not bad against the run by any stretch, so it's not the greatest matchup here, but you got to imagine good divisional matchup here. Going to be some points scored. Javonte's still been super good on the year, very solid. He's going to remain a solid start for me in week 7 of the season. Next up, we have Sunday Night Football. We're going to have the Falcons traveling to face the Niners. Bijan Robinson. Oh, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football. I know I'm going to say it in every matchup that involves a Monday Night Football player for week 6. I'm sorry, but regardless of what happens in week 6 with Bijan Robinson, I'm still going to consider him a must-start running back no matter what. The Niners have fallen back in their ranking against the run. They're a bottom 12 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. So let's just leave it at that. As long as Bijan Robinson is fully healthy and he's active in week 7, you are starting him no matter what. And we really don't need to go over Christian McCaffrey either. He's a must-start running back no matter what. Tougher matchup against the Falcons. They've been one of the best teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, but it doesn't seem to matter who's healthy or not healthy for the Niners. If it's Brock Purdy, if it's Mac Jones, if all the receivers are out there, or none of them are out there. George Kittle plays. If he doesn't play, if Fred Warner or Bosa's hurt, it doesn't seem to matter. Christian McCaffrey is staying healthy this year. He's the only Niner who's not going to get hurt. I'm calling it right now. And he gets involvement, whether it's on the ground or through the air. You don't need to worry. 54 rushing yards this past week off of 17 carries, a rushing touchdown, his first of the year, 8 targets, 7 catches, 57 receiving yards. He now has 6 or more receptions in every game this year and 7 or more targets in every game this year. You just absolutely have to roll with him. RB1 in full PPR, RB2 in half PPR. No matter what, you're starting Christian McCaffrey here in week 7. All right, we have 2 Monday Night Football matchups this week. Let's start with the Buccaneers, who will travel to face the Lions. Unclear if Bucky Irving is going to play in week 7 or not. I think it's pretty likely he doesn't play. The early indications in terms of reporting is that he's not going to practice this week. So that's probably, in my eyes, meaning that he's not going to play, especially with the Bucs continuing to win football games. But this is a big football game on the road here against the Lions. And now we got Emeka Egbuka banged up. Chris Godwin's banged up. Mike Evans banged up. Offensive line is starting to get healthy. I don't know. It hasn't really seemed to matter for the Buccaneers, and they have a bye week in 2 weeks in week 9. So I don't know that there's going to be a huge push for Bucky Irving to play, especially when Rachaad White has filled in very nicely in the absence of Bucky Irving. So if Bucky plays, he's definitely still startable. This is going to be a good game script. Even against a tough Lions run defense, you got to expect points are going to be scored in this game between 2 of the best teams in the NFL. So if Bucky plays, he's still startable. But either way, Rachaad White is startable as well, because I think that some of that volume could be limited to Bucky if he's able to play this week. But ultimately, my prediction is that Bucky's out again in week 7, and Rachaad White, who's had 17.6 or more fantasy points in the last 2 games and 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, is the starting running back, and he's going to be a good start once again against a good Lions defense. You just got to feel good about the overall game script and the potential for points in this game. Jahmyr Gibbs, coming off of his worst fantasy day of the entire season, with just 7.5 fantasy points. That is his worst performance in the fantasy realm since week 17 of his rookie season. But you got to still feel good about Jahmyr Gibbs on a week-to-week basis. The Buccaneers have fallen back quite heavily in their rankings against running backs, but still got Vita Vea up the middle. But I don't know. I mean, once again, you got to feel good about potential points scored in this game. It's Jahmyr Gibbs. The game script didn't really benefit him in week 6. It didn't benefit David Montgomery either against the Chiefs. The Lions were kind of forced to throw. Then in the red zone, they threw a lot as compared to, it looked like early in that game, like there was going to be like a Gibbs game and a game where they're going to be able to run the football all day long. And then after the first drive, it just like didn't really happen. So I don't know. You still got to feel good about Gibbs. Still roll with him if you own him. Monty, I have as startable, who I have as startable every week. And the last 4 weeks really reflect that. 29.4 fantasy points, 1.2, 18.2, 8.1. He's very game script dependent. He's always going to have involvement. And this could be one of those game scripts where I don't know if it's going to be great for Monty ultimately. But nonetheless, he's always startable, always an option if you guys don't have anything better as we move into week 7. All right, to wrap it up, we have the Texans traveling to face the Seahawks for the final game, Monday Night Football. Let's start with the Texans side of things coming off of their bye week. We got Nick Chubb, we got Woody Marks. This is kind of a weird one to evaluate. I think Woody Marks could get really involved here as the Seahawks have been really bad against receiving running backs. They've given up the most receptions of any team to running backs on the season so far. So I think Woody Marks could see that type of involvement. I also think Nick Chubb could get involvement and scamper into the end zone. So I don't exactly know how I feel about this one. The Seahawks overall are bottom 10 against opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed. So both these guys are startable, but this is not really a great offense, a great running back room when it comes to fantasy football. So I'll just leave it as startable and kind of like desperation starts. But Woody Marks could, on paper, have a nice week, at least the way things are looking. And speaking of backfields that are not good for fantasy, the Seahawks, right next to the Patriots, probably take the crown here. Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet, both had exactly 4.7 fantasy points this past week. Walker had 11 total touches. Charbonnet had 13 total touches. I mean, what do we do here? They're both just startable. It's not a great matchup against the Texans. They've been top 10 against opposing running backs on the year so far. They're both startable, but they're kind of just into that like category of they're touchdown dependent, and you don't want to say sit them because either guy could pop off any week. Either guy could have a solid week any week. It's a tough backfield when it comes to the running back position. And we know this Clint Kubiak system, they want to run the football. They want to be able to, do a lot of play action type plays, and they're doing all of that. It's just not really benefiting us from a fantasy perspective because both running backs are getting such involvement, and the passing game is looking really good under Sam Darnold right now. So startable, but I can't call them anything other than that here in week 7. And there you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single running back, and who you should be starting or sitting here in week 7 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So make sure you guys drop your fantasy questions. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the entirety of the week. And while you guys are down there, it really does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that like button and that subscribe button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 7 fantasy content. We have everything that you could possibly need here on the channel to absolutely dominate this week and every week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.